somewhere in the last 24 hours, you almost certainly had a conversation you never agreed to have. Maybe it was in the shower, or in the car, or in that strange hollow hour at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and the mind is not. You replayed something someone said to you. You drafted a reply you will never send. You rehearsed a meeting that has not happened yet, and you lost it, and then you rehearsed it again and won. Nobody scheduled this. Nobody invited it. And when it finally stopped, you did not feel rested. You felt used. Here's the question that a small book published in 1997 put at the center of everything: who exactly was talking, and who was listening? That book is The Power of Now, subtitled A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment by Eckhart Tolle. It has since sold something on the order of 16 million copies and been translated into 33 languages, which makes it one of the most widely read spiritual books of the last half-century. And its central claim is almost absurdly simple, so simple that people often hear it, nod, and completely miss it. The claim is this: most of your suffering is not caused by your life. It is caused by your thinking about your life. And you have mistaken that thinking for yourself. That is a strange thing to be told. We are raised to believe that thinking is the most trustworthy part of us, the crown jewel, the thing that separates us from the animals. Tolle does not deny that thought is a magnificent instrument. What he denies is that you are the instrument. He argues that you are the space in which the instrument makes its noise, and that the difference between those two positions is the difference between a life of low-grade torment and a life of peace. In the next 40 minutes or so, I want to walk you through what he actually says, where the argument is strong, where it strains, and what a reasonable person can take from it without having to adopt the entire cosmology that comes attached. Because there is something genuinely useful in here, and it survives translation into plain language. Eckhart Tolle was born in Germany shortly after the Second World War, spent part of his adolescence in Spain, and eventually settled in England, where he studied at the University of London and began research at Cambridge. On paper, it looks like the beginning of an academic career. In reality, by his own account, he was miserable in a way that had nothing to do with his circumstances. He describes years of continuous anxiety punctuated by episodes of suicidal depression. He was, he says, a person who could analyze anything and rescue nothing. The turning point he describes in the book's introduction is the sort of thing that either lands for you or does not. He was 29. He woke in the night in a state of dread so total that he found himself thinking that he could not live with himself any longer. And then, he says, the sentence stopped him. If he could not live with himself, then there must be two of them, the I and the self that the I could not live with. Which one, he wondered, was real? What follows in his telling is not an argument but an event. He heard words, as if spoken inside his chest, telling him to resist nothing. He felt himself being pulled into a void. He lost consciousness, and when he woke the next morning the world was luminous and, crucially, the fear was gone. He then spent roughly 2 years, he says, in a condition of uncomplicated bliss, largely without possessions, often sitting on park benches, with no ambition to do anything at all. Only later did he begin reading spiritual literature and find, in Buddhist texts and Christian mysticism and the Hindu non-dual traditions, vocabulary for what had happened to him. This origin story matters for how you read the book in two opposite directions. On one hand, it explains the book's tone. Tolle is not a scholar building a case. He is a man describing a place he claims to be standing in and offering directions. That is why the prose has an unhurried, almost flat serenity that some readers find hypnotic and others find maddening. On the other hand, it explains the book's most obvious vulnerability. A private, unrepeatable experience is not evidence. You cannot check it. And a great deal of the book asks you to accept, on the author's authority, descriptions of consciousness that no one can independently verify. The book itself was first brought out by a very small press in Vancouver and sold in modest numbers for a couple of years, passed along hand to hand. It became a global phenomenon around the turn of the millennium after Oprah Winfrey recommended it, which pushed it onto the bestseller lists and eventually made Tolle one of the most recognizable spiritual teachers alive. His later book, A New Earth, published in 2005, extends the same diagnosis, with much more attention to the ego as a social and collective force. One more structural note. The power of now is written as a dialogue. Questions appear in italics, drawn from Tolle's years of one-on-one counseling and small group teaching, and he answers them. This is why the book circles. It returns to the same handful of insights again and again from slightly different angles, the way a teacher does with a student who keeps sliding back into an old habit. If you read it as an argument, the repetition feels like padding. If you read it as instruction, the repetition is the method. The first chapter is titled, "With No Hedging, You Are Not Your Mind," and it contains the move on which everything else depends. Tolle asks you to notice the voice in your head. Not to analyze it, not to argue with it, just to notice that it is there, and that it essentially never stops. It comments. It compares. It complains about the weather it cannot change. It rehearses conversations. It narrates the present in the past tense, while the present is still happening. Most people, he says, have never once considered that this stream is optional, because they have been swimming in it since before they could speak. Then comes the pivot. If you can hear the voice, then there is something in you that is not the voice. The listener is not the speaker. He calls the voice the thinker and the awareness that registers at the watcher, and he insists that you are the watcher. His informal proof is simply that you noticed. Awareness of a thought cannot be that same thought, any more than the eye can be the thing it sees. He extends this to feeling. Emotions, in his account, are largely the body's response to thought, the physical echo of an interpretation. A resentful story produces a tightness in the chest. The tightness then feels like proof that the story is true. The story renews itself to justify the tightness. Round and round. He is not saying emotions are illusions or that you should suppress them. He is saying that they are weather in a sky, and that you have confused yourself with the weather. The practice that follows is deceptively small. Listen to the thinker the way you would listen to a talkative stranger on a train, with attention, without argument, without judgment. Do not try to stop the thoughts. Do not congratulate yourself for having good ones or scold yourself for having ugly ones. Simply be the awareness in which they occur. Tolle claims that thought loses much of its compulsive grip under this kind of neutral attention, the way a bully deflates when nobody flinches. He is careful, and this is the part critics most often skip, to say that this is not anti-intellectualism. Enlightenment, he writes, means rising above thought, not falling below it to the level of plants and animals. In the state he describes, you still think when thinking is called for, and you think better, because the thinking is being used rather than using you. The problem is not the tool. The problem is compulsion, the 12 hours a day of unrequested mental noise that produces nothing, solves nothing, and quietly determines your mood. I find this the strongest section of the book, and it does not require you to believe anything metaphysical. It is testable in 10 minutes. Sit still, watch what your mind does, and see whether you can find the boundary between the thoughts and the one noticing them. Most people, doing this honestly for the first time, discover two uncomfortable things: how little of their mental activity they authorized, and how much of it is unpleasant. In the second chapter, Tolle introduces the idea most likely to stay with you, whatever you make of the rest. He calls it the pain body. The claim is that unresolved emotional pain does not simply evaporate. It accumulates. It forms a kind of residue that lives in the body and the psyche as a semi-autonomous field of old grief, humiliation, rage, and fear. And this accumulation is not inert. It has, in his description, something like an appetite. It lies dormant, sometimes for weeks, and then it wakes, and when it wakes it needs to feed, and what it feeds on is more pain of the same kind. So it steers you. It makes you pick the fight. It makes you reread the message that hurt you. It makes you say the sentence you know will detonate the evening, and some part of you watches yourself say it and cannot stop. Now, taken literally as an entity, this is unfalsifiable and frankly a bit spooky. Taken as a description of behavior, it is one of the most accurate things I've read about why people sabotage their own peace. Anyone who has ever been in a long relationship recognizes the pattern. Two pain bodies, each triggering the other, each convinced it is responding to the present when it is really responding to 1994. Trauma researchers describe something adjacent in more clinical language: the way old dysregulation gets stored and reenacted. Tolle got to a version of it in 1997 with no data at all, which is either impressive intuition or a lucky metaphor, depending on your temperament. His prescription is consistent with everything else in the book. You do not fight the pain body, because fighting it is feeding it. You do not analyze its origins at length, because analysis keeps you in the mind where it lives. You watch it. You feel it as sensation in the body without immediately attaching the story that explains it. And crucially, you notice the moment of arrival, the small drop in temperature before the reaction begins, because attention at that moment is the only real leverage point. Once the wave has broken, you are along for the ride. He goes further, and this is where reasonable readers begin to part ways. He suggests that collective pain bodies exist, in families, in nations, in whole peoples, and that they explain a great deal of history's recurring cruelty, including atrocities and economic systems he regards as structurally violent. There is something to this as poetry. As explanation, it is thin. Historical catastrophe has causes that are institutional, material, and political, and a theory that reduces them to unmetabolized emotion is not going to help you understand very much. I would take the pain body as a superb personal diagnostic and hold the civilizational version loosely. The title of the book is not a slogan about seizing the day. It is a metaphysical claim, and Tolle means it more strictly than most readers notice. His position is that the present moment is the only thing that has ever existed or ever will. The past is a set of memories, which are thoughts occurring now. The future is a set of projections, which are also thoughts occurring now. Nothing has ever happened outside of the now, including everything you remember. This is not mysticism, exactly. It is closer to a plain phenomenological observation. You have never had an experience that was not present tense. From this he draws a distinction I think is genuinely useful. There is clock time, which is practical, appointments, plans, learning from a mistake, buying groceries for Thursday. Clock time is fine. Tolle is not telling you to abandon your calendar or stop saving for retirement. Then there is psychological time, which is the habit of locating your identity and your sense of worth somewhere other than here. Psychological time says, I will be all right when the promotion comes. I cannot be at peace until they apologize. My real life starts after this phase ends. Psychological time turns the present into a corridor you hurry through on the way to somewhere better, and since the somewhere better is always ahead, you spend your entire life in the corridor. The specific mechanism he identifies is worth naming. The mind treats the present moment as a means to an end, and so the present is never good enough, by definition. Every moment is judged against a moment that does not exist. This is why people with genuinely enviable circumstances can be perfectly unhappy. Circumstances are never the variable. The variable is whether attention is here. He also has a sharp diagnosis of waiting. Waiting, he says, is a state of mind in which you want the future and reject the present, and most people wait far more than they realize. Waiting for the weekend. Waiting for the reply. Waiting in a small way in the checkout line, in which the 30 seconds of your life spent standing there are simply written off as not counting. Add those write-offs up, and you have discarded years. The practical suggestion he keeps returning to is almost embarrassingly modest. Ask yourself right now what problem you have this second. Not this week. Not in your life. This second. Usually the honest answer is none. You are sitting somewhere, breathing, with the next thing not yet arrived. What people call problems are almost always situations plus a mental projection of future consequences. Situations you can act on or accept. Problems, in a sense, are things the mind carries around and turns over when no action is possible, and they're optional in a way most of us never test. Where I think the argument overreaches is in the suggestion that this alone dissolves suffering. Some suffering is not a thought about the future. It is a broken body, a hungry child, a boot on a neck. Tolle would say presence changes your relationship to even that, and there is testimony from people in extreme conditions that supports him. But the book's near total inattention to material circumstance, to politics, to the difference between a person meditating in a comfortable room and a person under siege, is a real gap. Hold the insight, notice the gap. The word that gets Tolle into the most trouble is surrender, and it is worth spending time on because it is routinely misread. His claim is that a great deal of human misery comes from resisting what is already the case. The train is delayed. The rain arrived. The person said the thing. These are facts. Facts are simply the current shape of reality. The suffering, he argues, is not in the fact but in the layer of internal protest laid over it, the mental insistence that this moment should be otherwise, which is a demand aimed at something that cannot hear it and cannot comply. He also argues that our confidence that we are in control of our lives is largely an illusion and an expensive one, because it converts every unwanted outcome into a personal failure or a personal injustice. Read carelessly. This sounds like passivity, or worse, like a spiritual argument for putting up with things you should be fighting. Tolle explicitly rejects that reading. Surrender, in his usage, means dropping the internal resistance to what is already true this second. It does not mean dropping the action. In fact, he argues the opposite. Action taken from acceptance is clearer and more effective than action taken from resentment, because resentment spends half its energy on the fantasy that reality should have been different. If you are lying in mud, you can accept the plain fact that you are currently in mud and then stand up. The acceptance is what frees the hands. He offers a genuinely practical framework for any unwanted situation. Change it, leave it, or accept it completely, and do not take a fourth option, because the fourth option, which is what most of us actually choose, is to stay in it while complaining about it. That state is the one that corrodes people. It has all the cost of staying and none of the peace of choosing. I think this is the book's most immediately actionable teaching, and also its most easily abused. The abuse is what people call spiritual bypassing, using the language of acceptance to avoid confrontation you owe someone, to stay in a job or a relationship that is harming you, to dress up avoidance as equanimity. Tolle does not endorse that, but he also does not build many guardrails against it, and the flat, serene register of the prose can make ordinary self-protection sound like unenlightened struggle. If you take one caution from this whole discussion, take this one. Acceptance of the present moment is not agreement with the arrangement. You can be entirely at peace and still leave, still say no, still organize, still sue. For a book about consciousness, the power of now is unusually physical, and this is the part that tends to be underrated. Tolle's principal technique is not seated meditation in the formal sense, though he does not object to it. It is what he calls attention to the inner body, closing the eyes and feeling the aliveness inside the hands, the arms, the chest, the whole field of sensation from within rather than looking at the body from outside. He argues that the body cannot be anywhere except now. Thought can time travel, sensation cannot. So the body becomes a reliable anchor, always available, requiring no equipment, no cushion, no 40 minutes. 10 seconds of attention in the hands is enough to interrupt a spiral. He calls these anchors portals into the present, and he lists several. The inner body is one. Conscious breathing is another, not breath control, just noticing one full breath without editing it. Deep stillness or silence, where you attend to the silence around sounds rather than the sounds themselves, is another. And in one of the more counterintuitive passages, he treats the total surrender at the moment of great loss or defeat as a portal too, on the grounds that when the mind's strategies fully collapse, something else has room to be noticed. That is a hard teaching, and I would not offer it to someone in acute grief, but it does describe something people report afterward. Alongside these he gives more ordinary advice, and the ordinariness is a point in its favor. Slow down. Stop multitasking, which he treats not as inefficiency, but as a way of never being anywhere. Spend time in nature, where the environment is not itself full of thought. Do one thing at a time, and let the doing be the point rather than the delivery of the outcome. Notice the small habitual complaints, the muttering about traffic and weather, since each one is a tiny rejection of the moment and they compound. Let the future worries go by observing that worry is a form of pretending you can pre-live an event. There is also a strand of the book about relationships that deserves mention. Tolle argues that most romantic relationships oscillate between addiction and attack because each partner is asking the other to complete a sense of self that no other person can supply. When the other inevitably fails, the pain body wakes, and the same fight recurs with different scenery. His proposal is that the relationship becomes possible, rather than merely intense, when both people stop mining each other for identity and instead bring presence to it. He goes so far as to say that your partner's reaction is often a more honest report on your state than your own self-assessment, which is uncomfortable and frequently true. What is missing from the practice section is any real acknowledgement of the range of human minds. Tolle writes as though everyone's obstacle is the same obstacle. But some people are not dealing with an overactive narrator. They are dealing with clinical depression, with trauma that makes interior attention frightening rather than calming, with conditions where sitting quietly with sensation is not restful but destabilizing. The book offers no triage and no caution here. It is a genuine limitation, and one that later teachers in this space have handled better. Let me compress the whole thing into what I would actually want you to carry out of it. First, you are not the voice in your head. This is the load-bearing claim, and the only one you truly have to test for yourself. The evidence is immediate. You can hear it, therefore you are not it. Everything else in the book is downstream of that single separation. Second, thinking is a tool, and compulsive thinking is the tool running unsupervised. The goal is not fewer thoughts. It is thoughts you choose, and silence you can enter when you are not using them. Third, the pain body is real as behavior, whatever it is as metaphysics. Old pain seeks fresh occasions. Learn to feel it arriving in the body before it has written you a script and cast the people around you in it. Fourth, distinguish clock time from psychological time. Plan, remember, learn, prepare. But notice when you have relocated your identity into a future that does not exist, and notice how the arrival of that future never delivers what waiting for it promised. Fifth, the 3 honest options for anything you dislike are change it, leave it, or accept it fully. The fourth position, staying while resenting, is the one that costs the most and produces the least. Choose one of the 3 and mean it. Sixth, the body is the shortest route back. You do not need a retreat or an hour. Feel your hands. Feel one breath. Sensation only exists in the present, so attention to sensation is a return ticket that is always in your pocket. Seventh, and this is my addition rather than his, hold the cosmology lightly and the practice firmly. You do not have to accept claims about consciousness, the unmanifested, or the arc of human evolution to benefit from watching your own mind. The practices stand on their own, and they are compatible with therapy, with medication, with skepticism, and with a completely secular life. Eighth, be alert to the misuse. If the language of presence is helping you avoid a conversation you owe someone, or keeping you in a situation that is harming you, that is not peace. That is anesthesia with better vocabulary. There is a reasonable case against this book, and I want to state it plainly rather than smuggle it in. It repeats itself. It asserts far more than it argues, cites almost nothing, and answers objections by suggesting the objection is itself the mind defending its territory, which is a rhetorical move that cannot lose. Its cheerful indifference to material and political conditions can shade into quietism. And its author's authority rests on an experience that, by its nature, no reader can inspect. And yet it has sold 16 million copies, and I do not think that is only marketing. I think it is because the book names something almost everyone recognizes the instant it is pointed at, and that almost nobody in ordinary life ever points at. We are all carrying around a narrator we did not hire, who works nights, who is often unkind, and who has convinced us it is us. To be told, calmly, that it is not you, and that there is a place to stand outside it, is a genuine piece of news, and for a lot of readers it arrives as relief rather than as philosophy. So here is what I would do with it. Do not read The Power of Now the way you read other nonfiction, front to back, extracting a framework. Read 20 pages, then stop and actually try the thing on that page for a few days. The book is a set of instructions wearing the costume of a treatise, and it only pays out under use. And you can begin before you find a copy. Right now, wherever you are, stop reaching forward for a second. Notice the weight of your body against whatever is holding it. Notice one breath from beginning to end without improving it. Notice that in this exact second, before the mind supplies the next projection, there is very likely no problem here at all. That gap, the one that just opened, is the entire subject of the book. Tolle's whole claim is that it was always available, that it is available again in a moment, and that a life made mostly of such moments is not a different life from the one you have. It is the same life, finally attended to.